Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of From Dust to Verdict. I'm your host, James Nevin, a partner at the law firm of Brayton Purcell, LLP. This podcast is dedicated to the epidemic of accelerated silicosis in artificial stone countertop fabrication workers. In each episode, we explore important topics and issues about this occupational health epidemic caused by uniquely toxic artificial stone slabs, as well as the associated litigation. In episode 9, we broke down the petition filed by the Western Occupational and Environmental Medicine Association, or WOEMA, a coalition of more than 600 occupational medicine physicians across 7 Western states. WOEMA is urging the OSHA Standards Board to prohibit all fabrication and installation of countertops made from artificial stone slabs containing more than 1% crystalline silica. In episode 11, we recap the January 15, 2026 OSHA Standards Board hearing and the January 14, 2026 federal hearing on H.R. 5437, the foreign slab manufacturer bailout bill that would shield artificial stone slab manufacturers from civil lawsuits brought by workers with silicosis. Today, in episode 12, we will focus on OSHA at the Crossroads. Will California ban crystalline silica artificial stone or let workers continue to die while foreign manufacturers make billions? And specifically, let's discuss the February 19, 2026 OSHA Standards Board meeting, the central question that day, still not formally voted on, but at the heart of this discussion was this. Should California adopt WOEMA's petition to ban artificial stone containing more than 1% crystalline silica, or should it adopt the foreign slab manufacturer lobbyist position to arrest fabrication shop owners and study a licensing and certification pilot program for 3 years, while hundreds of more California workers get fatal silicosis and foreign manufacturers continue to make billions? Crystalline silica artificial stone, misleadingly referred to by the slab manufacturers as quartz, is at least 90% respirable crystalline silica, and these silica particles are nano-sized. The remaining approximate 10% is metals, toxins, and other carcinogens from resins, glues, and other additives used to color the material and bind the stone together. Cambria, the only major U.S. manufacturer of crystalline silica artificial stone, and the foreign slab manufacturer lobbyists argue that the problem is not the slab product itself, but rather non-compliance with the OSHA standards from a few bad actor fabrication shops who just need to be arrested. However, WOEMA's occupational health physicians, public health experts, and regulators, along with hundreds of published peer-reviewed global medical studies, have reached one conclusion. This uniquely toxic product cannot be fabricated safely by human beings, even with advanced engineering controls required by OSHA, and that is why the epidemic is already in the majority of California fabrication shops and growing and spreading to other states. In this episode, we will walk through key presentations and comments from the February 19th meeting and what it means for the future of the WOEMA petition. So what is WOEMA asking for? Before we dive into the February 19th hearing, let's quickly recap WOEMA's petition. WOEMA, over 600 occupational medical physicians in California, Arizona, Hawaii, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico, has asked the OSHA Standards Board to urgently revise 8 CCR 5204 to prohibit all fabrication and installation of countertops made from artificial stone slabs containing more than 1% crystalline silica. They explained that the 2023 OSHA Emergency Temporary Standard and subsequent measures from SB 20 have not stopped the epidemic of accelerated silicosis among artificial stone fabrication workers. They further explained that artificial stone is uniquely toxic because it combines extremely high crystalline silica content, at least 90%, with nano-sized crystalline silica particles that travel deeper into the lungs and are more reactive, and roughly 10% of the other material is toxins and metals and carcinogens from the other additives in the product. WOEMA's position, based on more than 100 peer-reviewed published medical and scientific studies, is that crystalline silica artificial stone therefore cannot be fabricated safely by human beings who are alive and breathe air, even in sophisticated shops, and that the only way to effectively stop further disease is to eliminate these slabs and substitute it with safer materials like non-toxic recycled glass made from amorphous silica as well as natural stone. Australia has already implemented a nationwide ban on artificial stone. Manufacturers and distributors there have switched production to safer substitutes, and fabricators have moved on to working with those safer materials without job losses in fabrication or construction. We'll start with Dr. Shpali Gandhi. Dr. Gandhi is a board-certified doctor in occupational medicine and pulmonary medicine and directs the California Silica Support and Research Network based at UCSF. She cares for many of the workers at the center of this epidemic.
In my clinic, I diagnose young men in their 20s with an incurable progressive lung disease. They live with the constant sensation of not being able to get enough air, and there is no cure. For many, this disease will be ultimately fatal. Importantly, many of these workers are doing their best to protect themselves. They work in shops that use water suppression. They use respirators. They are trying to follow the rules, and despite that, they're still getting sick. Every year that we do not fully address this exposure will result in hundreds more cases. But these are not numbers on a graph. These are people with families. They are fathers. It affects their children. I see the fear in their eyes every time they sit in front of me. These stoic young men come to my clinic in tears, not only because of what this disease is doing to their bodies, but because they can no longer provide for their families. I've treated multiple brothers from the same family. I've cared for patients who needed lung transplants in their 30s and 40s. And right now I have stacks of referred patients on my desk. Just last week, I saw 5 new cases in one day. We need urgent, effective action. I support the WOEMA petition because the current approach is not protecting workers, and we cannot do anything else that will delay the most effective way of protecting them. We cannot accept continued exposure while more young men develop an incurable disease, and we must act to stop this entirely preventable epidemic. Thank you.
Dr. Gandhi explained that the number of identified cases has grown exponentially without any sign of plateau. She sees young fathers who cannot breathe, who can no longer work, and whose only remaining option is lung transplantation. She explains that the current approach is not protecting workers, and California needs urgent and effective action on artificial stone. Later in the meeting, she raised another concern, that certain enforcement strategies could unintentionally criminalize workers who have very little control over their workplaces and could push fabrication even further underground.
My concern as somebody who speaks with these workers on a daily and regular basis is that this is going to put significant criminalization and blame on the workers that already are marginalized. They come from communities that where there are not very many safe options for them, and many of them tell us that they don't have control over what kind of workplace they work in. And so I think this kind of action distracts from overall upstream issue. And I understand that wanting to take something that is quicker, but I think that it is an oversimplification of the way the industry works. And our biggest concern with even the Cal OSHA emergency standard was that much of this work would go even further underground. And I think this would even further that end where we would not be able to intervene in these exposures when we don't even know where they're happening now. I think it would make this problem much worse.
Next, Dr. Kimberly Brayton from Brayton Purcell LLP spoke on behalf of the more than 500 artificial stone fabrication workers that we represent in California with silicosis.
The CDPH has 512 confirmed silicosis cases and has indicated that this number likely represents at least a 30% undercount. You have heard claims that this crisis is limited to a few bad actor dry shops that can simply be regulated away, but that claim is false. CDPH now publishes a dashboard which demonstrates the broad prevalence of silicosis across hundreds of shops. These same shops had no silicosis before the influx of artificial stone into the market. This disease is occurring despite compliance efforts, not because of their absence. You have also heard claims that some manufacturers, or at least Cambria, their workers don't have silicosis. But to be clear, despite a year of attempted discovery, those claims have not been substantiated. And even if they're true, their experience is simply not the experience of the industry at large, domestically or internationally. That is why the medical consensus matters. Physicians across the state, in the community, at academic institutions, in the departments of public health, and hundreds of peer-reviewed medical studies speak to the same conclusion. Crystalline silica artificial stone is uniquely toxic and cannot be fabricated safely by workers. This is not a failure of enforcement, it is a failure of product safety. The question instead is, why are we still debating regulatory band-aids for a product that medical experts have determined is inherently unsafe when workers are dying now? But don't listen to me, though I am a physician in addition to being an attorney. Listen to the doctors on the front line of this epidemic. Listen to the Occupational and Environmental Medical Association and actually let them present their petition, rather than conceding more time to industry lobbyists who continue to push their poison. Lives, not profits, must be the priority.
In a later follow-up, Dr. Brayton also pointed out that while dry cutting is extremely hazardous and must be addressed, dry cutting is not the main driver of disease among the many workers that we see.
We know from our work with our clients that the dry cutting is really the exception rather than the rule. And these people, our workers are using wet methods, and yet they still are exposed and they're still getting silicosis. So it won't address the overall problem. Only truly a ban will address the problem itself.
Dr. Robert Blink, an occupational environmental medicine physician, spoke on behalf of the 600 plus occupational health doctors from WOEMA. He explained why, after initially working on enhanced regulations, WOEMA concluded that a ban was necessary.
The problem is that the calculations we've done shows that you would need a reduction in exposures some 1,000 to 3,000 fold, which simply can't be done even with wet methods and with a respirator, anything short of like a spacesuit. So we have some other things that have been cast that are, I think, sort of a deflection of the problem, which is that engineered stone is inherently extremely toxic. And rather than regulate the PEL to a much lower level, we don't think that that's sustainable or obtainable, and therefore it really does need to be prohibited.
In his later comments, Dr. Blink translated the epidemic into a simple timeline.
The death clock is ticking. Calculations are that roughly one additional fabrication worker is getting silicosis every week, meaning that another person is consigned to an early death every 2.5 to 3 months. So whatever we can do to stop this quickly, please let's do that. Let's also prohibit the product.
Public Health and OSHA Standards Board owned personnel reinforced the message that artificial stone is uniquely toxic and thus fundamentally is different from natural stone. For example, former OSHA consultant and CDPH official David Harrington described shops that invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in advanced saws, routers, water jets, and comprehensive programs to protect workers, and still air sampling showed silica levels above the permissible exposure limit.
These shop owners spent several hundreds of thousands of dollars to come into compliance. Then they did air sampling and found that they were now sometimes below and sometimes above the action level and the permissible exposure limit. These Cambria and IFSA trade association speakers would have us believe that the problem is not the product, but the underground shop owners who don't have good shop practices. Even if you closed all these underground shops and bogus subcontractor arrangements, you would still have the shop owners I worked with who tried to do the right thing to protect their employees, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, changed work practices, and still had elevated silica dust levels. The bottom line is that the manufacturers have created an inherently dangerous product, and they have shifted the burden onto small shop owners. Voting for the WOEMA petition merely jumpstarts the process to review. You don't even have to go to Australia to see how the industry transitioned to a much safer recycled glass, amorphous, not crystalline silica, artificial stone countertop. Just down the road in Stockton, a housing developer today is installing these safer countertops in thousands of new homes being built in Stockton. Thank you.
OSHA's own Eric Berg, speaking on behalf of the OSHA Standards Board medical and scientific staff, drew a stark contrast between natural stone and artificial stone.
Looking at the slide 6, where it says all stone materials would have to be removed from the market to protect workers. I find this misleading and ignores the major differences in toxicity between artificial stone and natural stone, which are described in a large number of recent scientific papers, in particular the nano particulate exposures and the effects of chemical additives on the toxicity of respirable silica. So they're trying to conflate natural stone with artificial stone and trying to ignore the difference of toxicity. And as others have mentioned, Granite and other natural stones have been used for decades in California, and we had maybe 1 or 2 cases of silicosis a year. These fab shops, I assume, had similar conditions with what they have now, but silicosis cases were not being found then. And now, going forward to when artificial stone is now the major and dominant product on the market, we're getting nearly 1 silicosis case a day. That's an increase of about 365 times. Massive, massive increase. And the reason for that is because artificial stone is much more toxic and dangerous than natural stone, even at the same silica concentrations.
Together, these testimonies explained by WOEMA, everyone in the medical and public health community, and the OSHA Standards Board's own medical experts are telling us that artificial stone slabs containing more than 1% crystalline silica are so uniquely toxic that they simply cannot be fabricated safely by human beings and must be banned in order to end the epidemic of accelerated silicosis in young artificial stone countertop fabricators. Now, the board also heard a very different, fanciful story from the foreign slab manufacturer representatives in Cambria. Cambria's general counsel, Rebecca Schultz, and in-house industrial hygienist Marshall Engstrom described their fabrication operations and argued that the crisis is driven by non-compliant shops, not by the artificial stone slab product itself. I should also note that once again, Cambria was given the floor to present their opposition, while WOEMA has yet to be given an opportunity to present their own petition to the board, nor have the people and organizations truly representing the best interests of the thousands of artificial stone countertop fabrication workers. And much like we saw during the January Standards Board meeting, Cambria's statements were untethered to the truth.
For those observing or are new to the kind of work we do in my profession, industrial hygiene is the science of protecting the health and safety of people in the workplace by identifying, evaluating, and controlling work and hazards. There is no scientific mystery about why the California fab shop workers are getting silicosis. They are dangerously overexposed to a well-known workplace hazard. The many recently published articles do a great job of explaining that people will get really sick if they work in this industry without the proper safety precautions. The articles do not establish that people will get sick when this work is done in compliance with OSHA regulations and requirements.
Cambria asserts that aggressive criminal enforcement of a few bad actor fabrication shops, certification or licensing programs for shops, and collaboration between the foreign slab manufacturers and OSHA and district attorneys will stop the epidemic. Cambria utterly ignores the science that its artificial stone is uniquely toxic and ignores the data that the silicosis epidemic is already in a majority of fabrication shops, including the sophisticated shops in compliance with OSHA, not a few criminal bad actors. Cambria continues to maintain that none of the workers in their in-house fabrication shops have silicosis, yet they have no proof of that actually being the case. No high-resolution CT scans, no testimony from doctors who've examined these workers, nothing. No details about how many of their fabrication workers are human beings who breathe rather than robots. The truth is, Cambria does not know whether or not its very few human being hands-on fabrication shop workers have silicosis because it has never tested or tracked them. Some speakers from the fabrication industry echo the themes that Cambria put forward. Nate Kolinsky from Blocktops described his shop as compliant and argued that compliant shops are not creating silicosis in their workers.
I'm Nate Kolinsky, CEO of Blocktops, a compliant California fabricator. I've worked with all of you for years on the silicosis issue and safe practices for our industry. And concerning the proposed ban on engineered stone containing silica products, please consider the following. And Joe, I did write this down because I have a tendency to go really long, so thanks. Shops that do not follow the OSHA standards and have air quality above the Pell can create silicosis in their workers 100% of the time, and this is unacceptable. Compliant shops are not creating silicosis in their workers regardless of the product cut. For years, I've asked for an example of a worker getting silicosis that only worked in a compliant shop with air quality below the Pell, and no one has ever been produced. Non-compliant shops are exploiting their workers by misclassifying them as independent contractors to try to avoid all the protections required by law. This gives them an unfair competitive advantage by removing the expensive protections of workers' comp insurance, business licensing, safety equipment, and other mandatory employee benefits. This exploitation of migrant workers seems to border on human trafficking. There should be many other avenues available to enforce these practices outside of a product ban. In the past, OSHA has done a joint task force with CSLB and other agencies to combat these practices. A California engineered quartz ban will not work, in my opinion, because it can give a false sense of security when handling other products that can create dust when improperly handled. The same exploited workers will continue to use unsafe practices, but feel safe doing other products that have hazardous dust. The shops that aren't following safe practices or even California business laws can just bring a cheap version of the product in across the borders of California. How can California inspect slab composition, and who will do this? ISFA's licensing program puts the responsibility for enforcement back on the seller of the material, as it was for many years in California. All suppliers certified their customers prior to selling the material in the past. The lack of certification has allowed for all these pop-up shops to exist and their workers to be exploited. Strict licensing will return the industry to legitimate and compliant shops with plenty of opportunity for workers to earn a great living. Safe manufacturing jobs like this are the future opportunities for California workers. And thank you.
While Blacktop claims to be compliant, the data it submitted to Yale for its study proves otherwise. Moreover, Blacktop's workers do in fact have silicosis. We represent them, proving the point that compliance is not the answer. Even 100% compliance with OSHA regulations by every fabrication shop in California would not stop the epidemic of accelerated silicosis in workers. Crystalline silica artificial stone is uniquely toxic, and traditional, compliant methods of fabrication do not provide the protection needed to fabricate the material safely. Safety professional Michael Peelish warned against using bans as the primary solution for hazardous industries and emphasized the traditional hierarchy of controls, engineering controls, administrative controls, and respiratory protection. He left out the top two controls, which is elimination and substitution of the hazardous product.
My concern is the solution to a safety and health problems that plague an industry should not end in banning an industry when other solutions are available, notwithstanding what some of the commenters have said. If that were the approach taken by regulators, my fear is that workers from California would not drive trucks. They would not cut timber. They would not fly in airplanes, because these industries cause serious injuries. Industries cause serious injuries and death on a regular basis. Because if the regulatory bodies begin at the top of the injury and illness hierarchy and do not allow for the layers below, engineering controls, administrative controls, and respiratory protection to be effectively implemented, then other industries are at peril. I do not make this argument that silica is not harmful. I do not say that. I grew up in the northern and southern coal fields of West Virginia and made a career in an industry that took my uncles from this world too early due to black lung. I understand the nature of this illness. Accepting the data as presented by OSHA and the folks that have been on the call today, engineered stone workers are developing silicosis at a dramatic rate, and the state enforcement scheme is not working, even though robust and consistent laws are in place requiring compliance. The conclusions for this increase in silicosis cases drawn by OSHA include the persistent non-compliance by the hundreds of fabricators and the lack of OSHA enforcement capabilities to enforce the regulations effectively as key drivers to increase cases. We should enforce to the lowest common denominator. We should not regulate to the lowest common denominator.
Michael Peelish fails to note that engineering and administrative controls and respiratory protection have been shown in over 100 peer-reviewed medical studies to be ineffective at protecting workers against the dangers of fabricating crystalline silica artificial stone, leaving elimination or substitution as the only viable solutions in NIOSH hierarchy of controls. Taken together, these foreign slab manufacturer-aligned comments argue that WOEMA's petition is misdirected and that the real priority should be enforcement, certification, and training rather than prohibiting crystalline silica artificial stone and replacing it with the safe alternative of recycled glass that all manufacturers except for Cambria already make and sell alongside their toxic product. Now, several speakers placed the February 19th hearing within the broader legal and human story, how cases are diagnosed, how workers seek justice, and how some manufacturers are seeking immunity. For example, attorney Raphael Metzger described the pattern that he sees.
I am seeing new workers, about 5 to 6 per week, We get them tested. We get chest x-rays done and have them be read by a B reader. 90% of them are being diagnosed. A generation ago, stone countertops were fabricated from natural stone, which has silica. And certain natural stones even have high concentrations of silica, like quartzite and sandstone, approximately the same concentration as artificial stone. But there has never been a reported case of silicosis in a stone fabricator who only fabricated natural stone. The artificial stone is inherently defective. It is unreasonably dangerous. I meet with clients who are fabricators almost every day of the week, and I get their medical records. Some of them have pulmonologists. I just met with a client yesterday who has a pulmonologist, and the pulmonologist has the wrong diagnosis. 90% or more of these workers are misdiagnosed. They're misdiagnosed as having pneumonia, sarcoidosis, tuberculosis, non-mycobacterial lung disease, and these are misdiagnoses. So this is a true tragedy, and it is entirely preventable by prohibiting the fabrication and use of artificial stone and as well as the installation.
His comments emphasize two key points: that misdiagnosis is common, which means the official case counts are likely underestimated, and that the silicosis epidemic among countertop workers did not exist at all. The rate was 0 when only natural stone countertops were being fabricated. Rachel Van Griemhoven from WorkSafe reminded the board that this debate is happening at the same time that the foreign slab manufacturers are asking federal Congress for legal immunity from civil lawsuits, as we discussed in episode 11.
Cambria General Counsel Rebecca Schultz said, "We are doing everything we can with Cal OSHA to try to promote worker safety." This cited cooperation with California regulators was touted to appease legislators at a hearing that was actually about their proposal that Congress grant them absolute immunity from the havoc that their product is wreaking on California workers, families, and communities. Due to the use of this product, hundreds of California workers are getting sick and dying, a painful and frightening death, which takes young people in their prime and leaves young children without a parent and homes without a provider. The company's response is to pursue legal immunity from the devastated families of these employees. There is no moral ambiguity here.
She pointed again to Australia's prohibition on artificial stone and the existence of safer alternatives, arguing that adopting WOEMA's petition would be the most direct way to protect workers in California.
I just want to say Rebecca's stated dedication to preventing worker deaths is inspiring. I'd find it a lot more convincing if Cambria wasn't meanwhile pursuing legal immunity from the harm their products bring. We appreciate your recognition of the seriousness and urgency of this matter. Many of you on the board have heard directly from workers suffering from silicosis. Dozens have died, hundreds more are sick, hundreds more may die in the next 5 years if nothing is done to stem the use of this dangerous product. Over 90% of sites visited by Cal OSHA are not in compliance with your rules to protect workers. There is simply no remedy that will address this problem as rapidly and effectively as adopting the WOEMA petition to ban this manufactured stone product. There are alternative products at the ready. After thorough examination of the issue in Australia, a complete ban of the product responsible for silicosis was determined to be the best path forward, and it was accomplished with little financial impact to workers and businesses. We request that the board accept the WOEMA petition and send to Cal OSHA for review. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
In the final portion of the meeting, the board shifted to an appalling theme designed to protect the profits of foreign slab manufacturers. Instead of a ban on their uniquely toxic products, they want criminal enforcement of dry cutting violations. Board Chair Joe Alioto absurdly proposed that the board should send a letter to district attorneys in 7 counties, those that account for approximately 95% of California's reported silicosis cases, highlighting that dry cutting artificial stone in violation of Cal OSHA's regulation can already be a misdemeanor or felony, and encouraging DAs to prioritize these cases.
I am proposing that we, as a board, write a letter to the district attorneys of 7 counties regarding the silicosis issue. As some of you know, or as you may or may not remember, I've made various comments throughout the course of the last few months about the role that I think the counties could play in preventing some of the silicosis, preventing those from continuing to dry cut or otherwise violate Regulation 5204. And I've suggested to some and others that it is in fact a misdemeanor and in some cases a felony for these fabricators to dry cut. I have an idea, and the idea is as follows: that we as a board would write a letter to 7 counties, those counties being Alameda, Contra Costa, Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, San Diego, and San Bernardino. 95% of all silicosis cases in California emanate from just those 7 counties. I will either send this letter on my own or I will send it on behalf of the board. It would be much my preference to send this for us to send this on behalf of the board. Here's what the letter would do. It would give an overview of silicosis. It would show that 95% of all silicosis cases are in these 7 counties. It would point out that heightened enforcement in these 7 counties would significantly contribute to our interagency collaborative battle against this disease. It would outline the silicosis regulation, and it would focus on the dry cutting ban specifically. It would outline labor codes sections 6423 and 6425, and those 2 code sections criminalize certain violations of Cal OSHA regulations. I would demonstrate through the letter the letter would demonstrate how and why dry cutting is actually a criminal practice. And I would ask we would ask these 7 counties to prioritize prosecution of misdemeanor and felony dry cutting violations, and also to offer to make ourselves available to assist in the training of their staff and law enforcement office partners. So to help their law enforcement partners and also these DAs to understand a little bit more about these regulations so that they can start focusing on these prosecutions of these people that are continuing to dry cut. And I think that if we just get this word out to all 7 counties, we can start to encourage them to take part in, be more aggressive in policing some of this illegal activity that's resulting in so many deaths. The DA's got to start helping us pick this up a little bit to the extent that they can so that we can start to criminalize this behavior, because they're killing people. These dry cutting shops are killing people.
This is utterly disgusting and inhumane. It utterly ignores the science, including the science from Cal OSHA's Standards Board own medical staff. It utterly ignores that the vast majority of shops already do not dry fabricate. It utterly ignores that the foreign slab manufacturers still market their uniquely toxic artificial product as natural to the fabrication shops and tell them that they don't even need to wear a mask. It utterly ignores that the silicosis epidemic is already in a majority of California fabrication shops, including the sophisticated shops, not just a few criminal bad actors that Chairman Alioto and the foreign slab manufacturers want to just throw in jail. It is time to seriously ask the question: why does Chairman Alioto continue to ignore all of the doctors and hundreds of peer-reviewed medical studies and his own Cal OSHA medical staff? Why does Chairman Alioto care so much about the profits of foreign slab manufacturers and mega billionaire Marty Davis in Minnesota? He's not protecting a single California workers, not their jobs, not their lives. Just like in Australia, California workers could safely fabricate non-toxic recycled glass slabs with 0 job loss. What the heck is wrong with this guy? Adding insult to injury, former Cal OSHA official Mike Donlin recommended using Cal OSHA's Bureau of Investigations to develop criminal cases and work closely with DAs, and Bruce Wick suggested DAs to designate specific investigators and prosecutors to focus on criminally prosecuting hardworking fabrication shop owners.
Mike Donlin, MD Safety Service. You should talk to Dan a little more about the Bureau of Investigation, because they're tasked with taking Cal OSHA cases, doing a criminal investigation, then taking that criminal investigation to a DA. And they've built up that office again. It's gone down to nothing. It's all filled now. Back in the early 2000s, they did the same thing, and they had a push with a lot of these DAs, and some DAs were really gung-ho and we're prosecuting on this, get involved with the California District Attorneys Association. That's a good place to start. We were involved with them back in the early 2000s. I was part of that. And, but I think going through the Bureau is a better way because they can build a case and take it to the DA, because most of the DA investigators aren't familiar with occupational injuries or occupational illness. They normally just look at fatalities or catastrophes, but I mean, these are all fatalities in the making. So, yeah, but I would talk to Dan some more about that option also. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Just want a quick comment, and I appreciate, Joe, what you're trying to do. This is really important. As you said, a little commentary on district attorneys. I'm part of a group that employers fund district attorneys with incentive funding to prosecute workers' comp fraud because that's a felony. So each of the counties you mentioned actually get millions of dollars a year to prosecute workers' comp fraud, and they designate a separate unit with investigators and enforcers or prosecutors, two separate people within the DA. And they learn workers' comp, they're dedicated to it. I would suggest that you be maybe clearer what you're asking them to do, because it might be something like you're asking each district attorney for pick a period, 3 years. I would suggest a joint letter with Cal OSHA enforcement, because we don't want to say Cal OSHA is ever unable to enforce this, but there's a crisis in doing so. And maybe for a 3-year period, we ask them, each DA, to designate an investigator and a prosecutor to meet with Cal OSHA, learn what this industry is, where an investigator can go in, put their package together, hand it to the prosecutor, and move fast. That's what they do in workers' comp, and it's extremely effective. So I just think a letter's helpful, but I think we want to understand that they have a lot of resource challenges, and we want to say why this is important, and we want them to designate people who can make a real difference. And I think they could if they understood there's a temporary time frame for it. Thank you.
Cambria's Rebecca Schultz stated that Cambria had already contacted the Los Angeles County DA after a prior meeting, providing information, and would be reaching out to other counties. She said Cambria is willing to share evidence from workplace safety lawsuits to assist with prosecutions. In other words, dare to sue Cambria for giving you fatal disease, and Cambria will ask that you be arrested.
I wanted to let everyone know that we at Cambria have reached out to the Los Angeles County District Attorney shortly after last month's meeting. And there have been ongoing conversations, including as recently as last night with them. They have requested additional information from us, which we have provided, as well as a memo outlining the issues in these workplaces. And we want people to publicly be aware that there's a great deal of evidence and information in the underlying workplace safety lawsuits that have been brought by injured workers and the plaintiffs' attorney firms. And certainly from Cambria, we would be very open to sharing what we have learned through the course of these lawsuits, and would encourage others that have such information to also share it so that we can address this workplace safety issue as swiftly as possible, including through the county DAs. And I'm ready to say that we will also contact the other counties in Los Angeles where these workplace injuries are occurring so that we can address them as quickly as possible. Thank you.
As we heard earlier, Dr. Blink from WOEMA supported efforts to stop dry cutting, which already worked long ago. There is no more dry cutting, while emphasizing that enforcement of Cal OSHA standards should not delay the immediate and permanent solution addressing the uniquely toxic product itself by banning it. And Dr. Godney warned that if not carefully designed, criminal enforcement could shift blame onto workers and push fabrication further underground, making this already difficult epidemic even harder to address. So, what does this all mean for the WOEMA petition? By the end of the February 19th meeting, the Cal OSHA Standards Board had not yet voted on WOEMA's petition to ban artificial stone containing more than 1% crystalline silica. That decision awaits a formal memo from the Cal OSHA and board staff, expected at the future meeting in likely April, outlining the options and recommendations. But the outlines of the decision are clear. On the one side, MAGA billionaire company Cambria from Minnesota and the foreign slab manufacturers falsely contend that the core problem is non-compliance with existing rules, not the artificial stone uniquely toxic product itself. They contend that artificial stone can be fabricated safely when rules are followed and when shops implement sufficient controls. They contend that the correct response is more enforcement, certification or licensing schemes, and criminal prosecution of violators, not a ban on artificial stone. On the other side, occupational doctors and public health professionals, the Cal OSHA Standards Board's own scientific and medical staff, the CDPH, UCSF, UCLA, you name it, and workers and their advocates are telling the board that artificial stone is inherently and intrinsically more toxic than natural stone because it's at least 90% crystalline silica, the particles are nano size and more reactive, and they're combined with toxic metals and resins and volatile organic compounds. They're telling them that even the sophisticated shops with millions of dollars worth of equipment have seen high rates of silicosis among workers exposed to artificial stone, and the number of cases continues to grow with young workers facing lung transplants and early death. And that safer substitutes already exist: recycled glass, porcelain, and natural stone. And the real-world experience in Australia shows that fabricators can transition to those materials without losing their livelihoods. So the board is now at a crossroads. Will California follow Australia and adopt a prohibition on artificial stone containing more than 1% crystalline silica, as WOEMA, doctors, the CDPH, and Cal OSHA's own medical staff and effective workers have urged? Or will it choose a different path, relying primarily on criminal enforcement of non-existent bad actors and certification and licensing in an effort to make uniquely toxic artificial stone magically safe enough to keep in the market so that the foreign slab manufacturers and Cambria can continue to make billions of dollars while California fabrication workers die? The evidence gathered over the last decade points in one direction. The fabrication of uniquely toxic crystalline silica artificial stone has produced a devastating epidemic that cannot be controlled with traditional workplace controls. Prior, the rate was 0 when it was only natural stone. It cannot be controlled by stronger enforcement of Cal OSHA regulations. It cannot be controlled by the most sophisticated safety equipment. It cannot be controlled by the criminalization of so-called bad actors. It can only be controlled by banning crystalline silica artificial stone and substituting the material with safer alternatives that already exist in the market. Cal OSHA needs to make the right decision so that the lives of artificial stone countertop fabrication workers do not continue to be put at risk of developing this fatal yet entirely preventable disease. They need to do it soon. Chairman Alioto, the death clock is ticking. How many more California workers' lives will you take while you help slab manufacturers in Minnesota and foreign countries protect their billions in profits? Thank you for tuning in to this episode of From Dust to Verdict. I'm your host, James Nevin, from the law firm of Brayton Purcell LLP. Remember to share, like, and subscribe. Stay tuned for our next episode where we will continue our discussions of the silicosis epidemic caused by uniquely toxic crystalline silica artificial stone, as well as the associated regulatory efforts and litigation. Para todos los que hablan español, les recomiendo que escuchen la versión en español de este podcast presentado por mi buen amigo Charlie Velasco Ariza.